I think the key issues for the sector this year are greater than they have been for a generation, and I think in my working lifetime the nearest equivalent would be the 1980s. So if I think about changing policy environment, it's quite extraordinary. Brexit, the setting up of the Office of Students in England, the UK Research and Innovation Organisation, the separation of research and teaching formally, really for the first time in maybe 100 years, is taking place. There are other things going on as well in the policy background to do with schools and other things, which are meaning that universities have got a huge amount of understanding of what direction to take and how to influence government. Then you couple that with finances. If you read the latest survey and understanding of financial forecast by the Funding Council, again I'm speaking about England, there are some serious problems emerging, I think, in terms of debt and liquidity for some parts of the sector. And of course we still don't show properly all of our pension liabilities, which are kind of off there somewhere. So I think for some universities, actually finances, how they can afford their capital programs, how they can actually stay afloat while making the dramatic changes some of them are going to need to make, is really quite a serious issue for them.
I mean, I think one of the key issues certainly is the impact of the EU referendum result and the decision of the UK, or some of the UK, to leave the European Union. Obviously the details of that hasn't been thrashed out yet, but the higher education sector as a sector, both in the UK and Ireland, and it's particularly relevant for Northern Ireland, is we have to work out how we engage with our fellow institutions across Europe, because the exchange of knowledge and the exchange of ideas and the exchange of research doesn't change because we're not part of Europe. That cross-fertilisation has to continue, and we have to work out a way how that's going to be funded. One of the other key things for me is how we engage with the changing demands of students and the changing nature of student life. Often we have people coming in from secondary level who actually have much better facilities and are used to a different way of working than universities can cope with, and we have to be more flexible in meeting student demands, not only in terms of pedagogy, but in terms of the facilities available to them and the types of spaces they like to study and work in.
Oh, I think the key issues in 2017 are many and variable because we're in such changing times. Brexit is obviously having a major impact on a number of universities, but not all of them. If you're not heavily dependent on European students, European funding, it's less of an impact. But I think the Teaching Excellence Framework is quite troublesome and quite unnerving in some respects. And I think the falling student demographic, we're scrabbling for a declining number of students, and they're getting very mixed messages about what the sector is offering. So I think it's a very interesting year to be managing higher education.
If you look across the higher education sector at the moment, I would see the key issues as being increasing uncertainty and increasing risk for institutions. If you look at what's happening globally, there's been substantial change over the last 12 months. If you look at what's happening in Europe, there's been substantial change. If you look at what's happening in the UK, there's been substantial change. So individual institutions are going to have to look at their personal circumstances and determine what they're going to do to manage that risk and that uncertainty.
The key issue for the sector is each year our cost base increases, so the pay awards, pension costs increases, and yet at the same time our main income streams are arguably flat. So each year we have to do more with the same amount of resource just to stand still, and that's quite a challenge. At the same time, our operating environment, our markets, if I can use that term, are increasingly sensitive to notions of quality and excellence. So at the very time resources are tight, at the very time we're having to do more around compliance, around all the things that are happening in the sector, we also have to increase and provide very high quality services, whether that's in our research operating environment, our teaching operating environment, or our other operating environments. The markets are increasingly sensitive to notions of quality, and there are no prizes for being second best. You look at REF funding, you look at the way students choose universities, it's all about quality, and that requires investment at the time when resources are tight.
I think 2017 will be an interesting year with many areas awaiting decision and development. Some colleagues will think immediately of Brexit and what is anticipated to happen in relation to international students, and these will have an impact on the long-term sustainability of the higher education sector, its profile and its shape. What I would also say will be interesting is how the sector engages with and enters the degree apprenticeship space, how big that is likely to become, and whether the government will continue to support it to the levels it is pledging at the moment, as we know that in the past apprenticeship funding has come and gone with different governments. What for me is personally interesting is what would happen if the fee cap comes off and fees become higher from the perspective of social mobility, because for all the rhetoric of loan funding, rising fees do alienate people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, and they do not achieve the social mobility agenda that they purport to do.
So I work in the Scottish sector and at Edinburgh Napier University, and from a Scottish perspective we're dealing with a number of big issues over the next few years. Like everybody else, we're dealing with Brexit and the consequences of Brexit, further complicated in Scotland by the possibility of a second independence referendum and all the attendant uncertainty that goes along with that. But outside of that, what are the big issues? Well, we're certainly concerned to redouble our efforts to recruit students, particularly in the context of the cap coming off in England and the way that's changing the competitive dynamics in the UK, but also because of increased competition globally. My own institution is very big in transnational education, so we're again spending a lot of time looking at some of our transnational education markets, particularly in Hong Kong and Singapore, which are now very mature markets, and we're looking at sustaining the growth in our global online presence. So we're looking to grow in some of the less traditional areas. Like everybody, finance is an issue. So it is for Scottish institutions too. And in Scotland, one of the things that is troubling for us is that the average amount of public funding per student, per undergraduate student, is now about £2,000 less per head than it is for an equivalent institution in England. So this is opening up a multi-million pound gap in our funding, and neither we nor any of the other Scottish institutions really know, I think, how that's going to be played out and resolved over time. And the final issue that I would highlight from a Scottish perspective, which is very much just about Scotland, is that last year the government passed a Higher Education Governance Act, which changed the way in which, or will change the way in which we need to people our governing body. And in particular, there are two major changes here. One is that in future we will need to elect the chair of our governing body from a constituency that is simply described in the Act as staff and students. And when you think about the complications of that, when I've already mentioned that students can be anywhere in the world and not necessarily receiving education in Edinburgh, that is a real complication. And the other big change coming out of the Act is that we will be required to have 2 trade union nominees on each of our governing bodies, and we think that will change the dynamic of university governance in Scotland as well. So some big changes coming. We've got until 2020 to be compliant with those new requirements, but watch this space. I think there'll be some interesting developments.